This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Alohamora by Imparfait, composed by Burning Aurora, Kaliana, and Flowerhawk. Chapter 1, Minerva. Term starts with a whimper for students at Hogwarts, except perhaps the first years, who come in all starry-eyed and hopeful. Minerva always thinks they look very small when she sees them huddled together in the entry, waiting to be led into the great hall. She can't remember herself that small, even though she's got a pile of photographs in her rooms to prove otherwise. That's the first years, though. For the other students, it's a slow march back to academia for yet another year. For the fifths and sevenths, it's worse. There's exams to worry about, the future to think of, which are excruciating things for students, rather than the burst of excitement that exists for the younger years. For the professors, the 1st of September is just another day in a weeks-long rush to make the school ready. And this year of all years, Minerva's thrown herself into making sure she's ready. There's her usual concerns, of course, updating her lesson plans, unpacking the few belongings she didn't leave behind when term ended for summer, liaising with the ghosts to sort through any offenses that Filch and Hagrid might have caused through the break. Seemingly endless meetings with Albus, of course, where they do the very serious work of planning observations and scheduling exams during those precious 3 weeks of prep before the students arrive. There's also a new list of tasks in her diary, things she must do for this specific year. For one, she's fireproofed her office and flood-proofed it, and set a series of trespassing jinxes on the door from her office to her private rooms, because this is their last year. The year the professors have lost the last of their collective minds and given James Potter a startlingly large amount of power. And there's the plan, of course. She spent half the summer with Phileas, plotting and planning, knowing full well that Albus knows somehow, under that air of twinkling eyes and jovial smiles, that something is going on under his nose. The head boy loss was a hard hit, she admits that to herself. She doesn't resent Pomona for her swap to Potter. She understood the argument being made by both Albus and Horace, even if Horace was a discriminatory bastard about it. But she got up, dusted herself off, and did what a Gryffindor who hat-stalled with Ravenclaw does best. She moved on to Plan B with absolute gusto. She needn't show her hand and bully her colleagues into installing a head boy, not when Potter's head boyship could and will work in her favor. After all, with Black in the hospital wing under Pomfrey's watchful eye, and Potter running himself ragged, trying to impress Lily Evans and keep the first years under control, Lupin would have nothing but time. Unless, of course, Pettigrew suddenly grew a personality worth spending considerable time with, which, given all Minerva had seen over the last 6 years, was a slim chance indeed. Still, it's a disquieting feeling, coming up against something unusual in the face of decades of certainty and routine. She thinks on it while she sifts through the pages and scrolls on her desk, her own careful handwriting sketching out a shaky future she isn't sure Remus Lupin will take from her willing hand. First, scribbled on the edge of a whisky-stained scrap of parchment, Binns needs his assistant. It's a long-held responsibility for one of the 7th-year prefects at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry to serve as Professor Binns's teaching aide. He's a ghost, not a poltergeist, and as such cannot physically mark papers or fill out the gradebook. Minerva finds it distasteful and ridiculous to ask a student to do the daft ghost's job for him, and Albus's refusal to give Binns the sack even more distasteful. She had, several years into her tenure, successfully lobbied for a small stipend to be provided to the student, mere nuts in comparison to an actual professor's salary, but certainly more than the criminally low rate Lupin charges for tutoring. A Ravenclaw usually assumes the mantle, though an occasional Slytherin manages to find their way into the mix on off years. They're breaking with tradition this year. She hopes Ben Fenwick won't feel slighted, though she finds herself with very little capacity to care if he does. Fenwick will be fine without the teaching aid credit on his CV. He's got a bright future in his father's broomstick business, from what she hears in the halls. Ursula Baines, the other Ravenclaw prefect, wrote to Phileas over the summer begging to be taken out of consideration. She had a research project with Aurora Sinistra that would take up a considerable amount of time. This, Minerva thinks, was Merlin himself smiling down at them. She's thinking about her approach as the last of the new first-year Hufflepuffs. Wickford, Ignatius, scurries to the far end of his new table, She passes the sorting hat off to an elf as she takes her seat between Phileas and Pomona.
Good showing this year.
She murmurs as Albus takes to his feet to give his usual cheery-eyed start of term speech.
They get smaller every year, I think.
Pomona replies, which pulls a soft huff of laughter out of Phileas.
Not to me,
He says with a wink. Minerva groans. They're quiet through the school song, discordant as it is. She's got one eye on Black and Potter, dead center at the Gryffindor table, lording over their gaggle of fifths to sevenths. It's still odd to see Evans in the mix, tucked under Potter's arm. It isn't often that she's wrong about the goings-on of students. She's seen everything in her considerable career, but she's happy to be wrong. If for no other reason than her sanity, or Evans knocking on her door at all hours to tell her she suspected that lot of being up to no good. Pettigrew, newly 17, has his wand in his hand and a flush to his cheeks that makes Minerva suspect there's more than pumpkin juice in the goblet he's lofting above his head, shouting,
"And learn until our brains all rot,"
at the top of his lungs. She heaves a sigh. It's going to be a long year. There's a folded piece of parchment, spello taped to the back of Remus Lupin's timetable. Minerva watches him poke blearily at it, the morning of September 2nd. She tries her best not to be obvious about it. It won't do, she knows, to be caught out staring at him. Lupin hates being gifted things almost as much as he hates being the sole focus of anyone's attention. Well, almost anyone's. She's distracted for a moment by a loud clatter to her left, Horace knocking his goblet to the ground. She looks back up from the spilled pumpkin juice running off the edges of the high table and into Professor Vector's lap, in time to catch Black snatch the note out of Lupin's hand, while Lupin stares up at her with big, wide eyes.
You've pulled the trigger, then?
Sprout says low and quiet in her left ear. She breaks away from watching her students and hides a grin behind her own goblet.
I have.
She says,
Now you just need to convince Albus to keep him.
Pomona murmurs.
No small task, Minerva.
The knock comes that afternoon, less than 10 minutes after she settled herself at her desk. She knows without a doubt it's Lupin, Black, or the both of them together. If she were honest with herself, which she tries to be, she's surprised Black didn't darken her doorway yesterday. She opens the door with a flick of her wrist, and it's Lupin standing there, clutching the note to his chest, eyes still wide. She knows the sevenths had charms that afternoon. She'd have to ask Phileas if he looked bewildered for the entire lesson. She fights down a smile at the thought.
Come in, Lupin,
She says.
Professor,
He steps inside, waving the note at her.
I think there's been a mistake.
She shakes her head. She's almost got to bite the inside of her cheek to keep the smile from breaking through. Oh, to be a fly on the wall in the tower this morning after breakfast.
There's no mistake,
She says. She waves towards the chair by the side of her desk, a silent offer of a seat, which he takes and drops into it, heavy-limbed and still unblinking.
You're more than qualified. The underclassmen you've been tutoring gave you nothing short of stellar praise, and I've heard, from a variety of sources, mind you, that you're fond of the material.
Surely Fenwick.
Fenwick can, if he'd like, seek out an apprenticeship or an internship through his head of house.
She levels a look at him, tight-lipped but still soft in the eyes. There's no bargaining space here, because he'll bargain his way out of something she knows he'll like, he'll succeed at, and something that will, one way or another, give him a path forward. He wilts in her chair, staring down at the note clutched in his hand for a long, long beat of silence that stretches on so long she wonders if perhaps she should speak again.
Did Sirius put you up to this?
His voice is hardly a whisper, but she hears him all the same. Her heart breaks in her chest. It's just wrong. How sure he is that the world can't give him anything on his own merits.
Have I ever been known to scheme with Mr. Black?
She asks him. He huffs out a watery laugh, half hysterical, like he's seconds away from breaking down.
No.
His voice breaks on the word. He scrubs a hand over his face.
No, you haven't.
She lets herself relax in her chair, a ghost of a smile slipping across her face.
Is it so unreasonable that I think you're qualified?
Lupin shakes his head. He takes a deep breath in, the sort of grounding breath she'd seen him take a dozen times when the four of them were called to her office when they were younger. He looks up at her. There's desperation in the crease between his eyebrows, and something she thinks might be a flicker of hope behind his eyes.
You really think I'm the best choice?
By a mile.
She promises. For a Friday night, the staff lounge is buzzing with activity. It's the first Friday of term, though, and Minerva forgives the rest of the faculty for disturbing her tradition of sipping a quiet whiskey and reading whatever Transfiguration today was left by the fire. She does not, however, forgive Fowler for taking Phileas's seat across from her, with a glass of wine in one hand and intentions on his face. He doesn't speak, just stares at her, blatantly at her, not at the fire.
Can I help you, Gordon?
She asks when her patience runs thin. A muscle in his jaw twitches.
Pomona tells me Lupin has been asked to sit as Bince's assistant this term.
All year, in fact,
She says. The article on the ethics of transfiguration in livestock is boring, but less aggravating than whatever nonsense Gordon Fowler wants to spew at her. She's certain.
Do you think that's wise?
She drags her eyes up, away from her journal, and stares at him.
I do.
She says, leaving no room in her tone for disagreement.
Lupin's achieved high marks throughout, completed his OWL, and is on track to complete the advanced course with an O. I would be hard-pressed to think of a more qualified candidate.
With his condition?
I believe Binns will be fine for the 36 hours a month Mr. Lupin needs to manage his health.
She says mildly. That annoying muscle in his jaw twitches again. Minerva, who considers herself a tolerant woman, mentally revises her estimation of what sort of man Gordon Fowler is. Ex-Ors, she scoffs to herself. There's a reason she left the department all those years ago. She doesn't have the requisite amount of paranoia and narrow-mindedness for the work. Her world has never been quite so black and white.
I don't think it's prudent is all, given that there's already been an incident once.
She narrows her eyes at him.
Gordon,
She warns. He holds up both hands.
I wouldn't feel as though I'd done my due diligence without pointing out that Fenwick, Cresswell, Evans, Ross, and Landry don't have health to manage.
She hates the way his voice draws out health.
well, thank Merlin you haven't been put in charge of making the decision, given that Cresswell and Landry aren't in the advanced course, and Evans has head girl responsibilities that will take decidedly more than a day and a half to manage.
She closes the journal in her lap.
I wasn't aware you were a bigot, Gordon.
He lets out an indignant splutter that sounds quite a lot like I'm not, but she can't have heard that right since he's spouting nonsense at her.
The matter is closed.
She sounds cold, even to herself. Minerva looks away, back down at her journal, and opens back up to the article on livestock transfiguration.
You're in Phileas's chair.
He hesitates, as though he's going to say something else, but chooses the wiser path and stands, swiping his wine off the table on his way past. This, she thinks, is an unforeseen hitch in an otherwise flawless plan. Chapter 2, Sirius.
Sirius Black has been an exemplary student in my Transfiguration course. He has exceeded expectations in all metrics, including independent study and completion of the Animagus ritual.
Sirius looks up from the parchment scroll in front of him, eyebrows raised, and meets Professor McGonagall's eyes.
You've put the animagery in here.
He says.
I have.
She answers. There's a hint of a smile tugging at one corner of her lips, but she ducks back down to her marking before he can get a word in.
It's impressive, despite being unsanctioned and dangerous. I did leave that out.
Under normal circumstances, he'd have a good retort, but it's hard for him to conjure one when he's reading things like exceptional talent for improvisational magic, which feels like a properly posh dig at his ability to jinx his way out of most of his problems, which he is very good at, thanks in no small part to his cousin's Sunday visits and the entirety of Slytherin House in general. He takes in a little gulp of air at,
It is my genuine pleasure to recommend Sirius Black to Oxford College of Magical Studies.
Seeing it there in Professor McGonagall's shiny green ink is the sort of thing that would have stunned his fourthy self. Somehow he's gone and grown up without realizing. Or he did realize. He's engaged. That's a very grown-up thing to be. He's a homeowner of sorts. That won't feel properly real until they move in when term ends. Adulthood feels like an oddly fitting outfit. He's sure he'll grow into it eventually, but in the meantime, it's a bit like wearing too big trousers with a too small shirt, facing a future of his choosing that's beginning to unfurl in front of him. It's more than he thought he'd ever get. It's turning out better than he dreamed, too. For a while, he sits there in her red wingback chair and picks out favorite bits of her letter. Creative problem solver is certainly one way to describe him, he supposes. But eventually, he shakes his head and clears his thoughts from this letter in his hands and his future at his feet, because he didn't come here for this at all. It's certainly a nice surprise. She's one less person he'll need to go to, hat in hand, begging to overlook the Hogwarts detention record he co-holds with their current head boy. He shakes his head again, pushing his gathering thoughts back into a file for later. He's got weeks to worry about them. He needs to start now.
Professor,
It's abrupt, an aborted start before he even properly begins. He doesn't know how to ask, not either of the questions he wants to ask her. Her quill stills on her parchment. She doesn't look up. He appreciates this about her, when she knows he needs to not be perceived. It's been hard for him to learn how to ask for help. He's quiet long enough that she does glance at him over the rim of her glasses while he searches for the words.
I'm worried about Remus.
He says it slowly, like every word is pulled out of him through some manner of torture. He keeps his eyes trained on the saucer under his teacup. This is hard, maybe harder than talking about himself, because these aren't his secrets to bear. He hears her set her quill down in the little gold rest by her inkwell. He hears her sigh. He still can't bring himself to look at her just yet.
Worried about what exactly?
She asks. He sucks in another breath and steels himself. Moony would do this for him. Moony has, in point of fact, gone to McGonagall with his own worries about Sirius more than once. This isn't betrayal or secrets spilled across the dungeon flagstones.
He's been resigned, I guess, to the thought that he's got nothing coming after we leave school in June. And James and we've both been working on it, trying to come up with something that'll work for him. Around his monthlies, I mean.
He does look up then, and meets her eyes. She's all raised eyebrows and a hard set to her mouth, but there's something in her eyes that looks almost like mischief, hidden away behind the blank stare she's trying to levy on him. She's good at hiding it. She's a professor, a poker player, a master of reigning in hot tempers with nothing but a glare. But he's a black. He learned far too early how to look underneath the mask on someone's face for the truth behind the lie.
I don't want there to be working isn't everything. I'd be happy to take care of him, whilst he dotes on our future pet cat and potters around in the garden, and spends my galleons on subscriptions to academic journals and an endless supply of sugar quills, as the stars above intended. But he wouldn't be happy like that. He wants to be useful, my Moony, and I want him to be able to.
He takes a breath and barrels on.
I thought you might have some ideas of, I don't know, something, anything, owl post-work, or, well.
He shrugs.
He's going on about being stuck, getting that look on his face whenever we talk about newts. I know he thinks it's all pointless. I don't. I don't know how to help him, and I feel like rubbish just sitting on my hands doing nothing.
For a long stretch, she says nothing, just peers at him over clasped hands. He shifts uncomfortably under her stare, crosses and uncrosses his legs, fiddles with the strap of his bag, rolls and unrolls the parchment containing a seventh of his own desperate chance to be something more than the world thought he ought to be.
I'll speak to him.
She promises and reaches for her quill again. He desperately wants to tell her that won't work, that he knows Moony already skived off his career meeting in 5th year, that if cornering Remus Lupin worked for anyone, it would certainly work for Sirius. And it did, in all matters but this.
There's also another thing.
One dark eyebrow twitches. Her quill stills, but she doesn't set it back in the rest.
About Remus.
He shakes his head.
No.
He says, his courage bursting through the apprehension in his head.
Well, in a way, a favor, really, to both of us.
He huffs and pauses to gather his thoughts as they skitter away.
For our hand fasting, we have to have a cord made. Then it gets soaked in. Well, there's a whole ritual around it, but that's not really relevant.
She's watching him closely now.
You're a 7th year, Sirius.
She reminds him.
You don't need permission to leave the grounds.
Oh, I know,
he says, biting down a laugh. September's hardly a memory yet, and he's already gone down the pub with the lads twice and taken Remus to dinner once.
Mum's made an appointment for us with a cord maker after solstice. That's not... We're meant to get strips of cloth from the people who matter to us. That's what it's made from. And we'd love it, Remus and I, if you'd be willing to.
He swallows down the lingering dregs of his fear that she'd laugh him out of her office.
If you'd be willing to gift us with a strip.
McGonagall stares at him for a moment, shock evident on her face, before she blinks her expression back to her usual half-severe look. If it weren't for the utterly sentimental glint in her eyes and the half-smile hidden by her pursed lips, Sirius would have been sure he was about to get a no. He's buoyed by a sudden flare of hope, though, and proven right when the smile wins out.
If you'd like,
She says.
We very much would.
He promises. He sighs and swallows back the urge to deflect.
You're important to us.
He settles on, which doesn't do any of the last 2 years justice, but it's what he's got. The Sunday after Sirius's meeting with Professor McGonagall, Remus gets called to the carpet and disappears into her office after breakfast. Sirius, who's a jittery pile of nerves to begin with, pokes at James as he finishes off his sausages. He manages to wrestle a Hogsmeade afternoon out of him, and they take off out the front doors of the castle without any subterfuge or need for permission. 7th year is freedom, at least to a point, in the constrained, safe way that Sirius has been dipping his toes into adulthood for almost a year. He can do what he'd like, but there's still rules and safeties to keep him from falling on his own face. Which is grand, because today Sirius has a plan, and he'd, at the very least, like a friend to be there with him. They tromp down the Hogsmeade path together, James weaving tales of his very first official head boy meeting with the headmaster, only half of which Sirius believes actually happened. He doesn't know Albus Dumbledore well, and he's glad for that, since the last time he was summoned to the headmaster's office, he thought he was rightfully going to be thrown out on his arse. He begged for it, is the truth, and he's glad Monty put a hand on his shoulder and said,
"No, Sirius."
James, however, spends the walk with his shoulders back and his chest puffed out, waxing lyrical alternately about how Lily's hair complements the gold of her head girl badge, and how the headmaster is impressed with his leadership skills. Sirius lets him go on. Prongs deserves it, he supposes, even if the very last thing he needs is an ego-stroking. They're turning onto the cobblestone path in front of the Hogshead before James finally runs out of steam, blinking up at Sirius with owlish eyes behind his glasses.
Are we having a pint then?
Sirius shrugs.
I thought
He says, trying to keep the hope and hesitation out of his voice.
that we might get a tattoo.
James stumbles to a stop next to him.
Padfoot.
He says, scandalized. When Sirius looks over at him, there's a grin stretching ear to ear on his face.
What are we getting? Earl of Buggery on your arse cheek. I won't be joining you in that, but I wouldn't say no to a nice rack of antlers on my bottom for solidarity.
Sirius shoves him in the shoulder and laughs when he almost falls onto his aforementioned bottom.
No, you twat.
He digs into his pocket and pulls out a scrap of parchment, waving it in James's face. It's a simple enough design, something Peter sketched out for him in Charms while Flitwick was prattling on about the syllabus on the first day of term. It's simple, just Padfoot's paw print nestled under a pair of antlers, but Peter's skill for drawing plants and fungi translates to other things, and it's beautiful.
I thought we'd get this.
Sirius shakes his head.
I'm getting this at least.
He clarifies.
But I booked for 2 just in case.
James snatches it from him. His grin doesn't falter as he stares at it for a moment.
It's brilliant,
He tells him,
but if Lily comes for my barlocks, I'm squarely blaming you.
James cries, which Sirius should have thought to expect. The tattooing shop is behind the Hogshead, down a dirt pack alley that Hogwarts students don't have a reason to venture down. It's a dark, dingy building, the sort of place that looks intimidating from the outside. That's by design, Sirius reckons. As he's gotten older, he's noticed it isn't just the Hogshead hidden away down dirt track roads and behind less appealing storefronts. There's places in the village for the students, and there's places for the locals. Inky Blotters is a place for locals, or he supposes as he pushes open the shop door and a bell tinkles overhead, a place for adults, which the vast majority of Hogwarts students are not. Inside is an explosion of soft, squashy chairs and paint splashed on the walls. There's photographs and paintings adorning the walls in mismatched frames. Pots of flowers litter low tables in the waiting area off to the left. The right is dominated by a large desk in front of a cabinet of tinctures, salves, and jewelry. The tattooist, Amelia Blotter, sits waiting for them behind the desk with a tall glass of fizzy orange at her elbow and a warm smile on her face that reaches right up to her brown eyes and deep lines on her forehead.
"Hello, Mr. Black,"
She says. She doesn't pretend not to know who he is on sight, and he likes that.
Bit early, but that's all right.
She peers at James over his shoulder.
And Mr. Potter, I presume. You're looking a bit green.
Well,
James says,
I've just remembered you're going to stick ink into my skin, and by all accounts it stings a bit.
She chuckles softly.
A bit. Less than you're imagining, I'd wager.
She gives him a good hard look.
Although I've been wrong about pain tolerance before.
They settle near her on a pair of stools in front of her desk. The cushions are bright orange paisley print, hideous to all of Sirius's sensibilities, but he finds himself liking it in an ironic kind of way. It fits her. She's a riot of color, in bright pink robes with a blue blouse peeking out underneath. Her fingernails are trimmed short but painted Hufflepuff yellow. Her arms are covered in intricate, sharp-lined designs from fingertips to elbows. It's what drew him to her for this. He saw a photo of her over the summer, in a Prophet article one early morning whilst he was waiting for the tea to finish brewing. The photo was focused on her left arm, adorned with winding vines, blooming flowers with stylized animals darting out from behind them. Amelia said in the article that some people wrote their stories on their skin. He wanted that then, on that late August morning, to etch the people he loves into his skin forever, his own tapestry along his arms, across his shoulders, down his chest. She takes the art from him when he offers it to her, narrows her eyes, and scrutinizes it while she speaks to them about the process.
9 galleons each for the tattooing, 2 sickles for a salve to help it heal.
She taps her fingers against the parchment, right in the center of Padfoot's doggy paw print, where Sirius had carefully added the rune for brother.
Do you want this exactly as it is, or is this just a reference?
Exactly.
Sirius says.
Our mate Peter drew it.
Fancies himself an artist.
She asks with a quirk of her eyebrow.
Well, he does all right.
James says.
Will it move?
It could.
She motions toward a stack of pamphlets on her desk with her elbow.
There's loads of charms to do, all sorts of things. The design doesn't really lend itself to motion, but I can apply some basic animation charms for you, if you like.
Which they would, which is how they wind up in the back of Amelia's studio, James flat on his front on a padded table, shirtless and sniffling out big whopping tears, while Amelia's tattoo machine works its magic against the skin of his left shoulder.
Don't be such a baby, Prongs.
Sirius teases. He didn't cry. He barely twitched at all, although the bulk of his right shoulder burns something awful now. He'll never admit it to James, though, not under pain of death. It's covered, thankfully, with a cool healing salve smeared over the whole thing and a gauzy bandage over it, charmed to stay.
It hurts.
James says. He screws up his face, bites down on his lip.
You're taking me for a pint after this.
Sirius rolls his eyes.
You cried less when your skull got caved in by that bludger last term.
I was unconscious.
I could knock you out if you'd like.
Sirius offers, saccharine sweet.
Fuck off.
James huffs, gruff and half teary. Amelia pauses, her machine going silent in her hand.
Do you need a break, Mr. Potter?
She asks. Sirius can tell from the look on her face, the strange half-formed smirk that's paired with brows furrowed in concern, that she's torn on what to make of James Potter.
I'm good. I'm fine. Brilliant. Love this. Definitely going to do it loads more times.
James takes in a deep breath and shoves his glasses up to rub roughly at his eyes.
I've learnt some things about myself.
That you've got the pain tolerance of a puffskein.
Sirius asks, which gets him a smack on the shoulder, the left one, thankfully.
I'll hex your ballocks off.
James threatens, but Sirius just laughs and skitters away from his swatting hand. Mooney's back in the dorm when they return early in the evening, tipsy from too much ale and wine. The sun's starting to set behind the forest to the west, and the light filtering into the tower is golden and lands in stripes across Remus's bed, where he's sprawled on his stomach with a pillow tucked under his chin and his history textbook open in front of him. Sirius falls onto the bed next to him, draping himself along his side and wiggling to fit just right, so his arm tucks under Mooney's armpit and his chin slots into the crook of his neck, a space where he fits just right.
You've gone drinking.
Mooney says as he turns a page.
Worse.
Sirius replies. He sucks a kiss against the skin he can reach, right by Remus's collar.
The drinking was celebratory.
Has Prongs finally divested himself of his virginity?
A laugh punches out of Sirius' throat, muffled by Mooney's skin and the fabric of his shirt.
No.
He murmurs.
It's too soon for Quidditch celebrations.
Mooney says, thoroughly undistracted, which makes Sirius try harder, shifting against him and lifting his head until he can press open-mouthed kisses against the hinge of Remus's jaw until Mooney huffs a little, contented sigh.
Have you done something ridiculous to the Slytherins?
There's a high, wispy sound in Mooney's voice. Sirius grins against his skin.
Prongsy and I.
Sirius says quietly, shifting again so his lips were right against the shell of Mooney's ear.
Spent the afternoon getting tattoos.
Mooney stills underneath him.
A tattoo?
Sirius mouths at Mooney's ear, sighing out an assent against his skin and nosing at his hair as he fumbles with one hand to ruck up the bottom of Remus's shirt. But then Remus is turning underneath him, and he's got no choice but to shimmy away, lest Mooney's knobby knees commit a grievous assault on him.
A tattoo?
Remus asks again, eyes wide, blush coloring the top of his cheeks.
Of what?
Sirius struggles all the way back up onto his knees with an indignant huff.
It's healing,
he says.
So I can't see it.
The pout on Remus's lips is almost too much to bear, but Sirius steels himself against Mooney's best pleading face.
Where is it?
My shoulder.
He's already tugging his shirt over his head, careful to not pull on the gauzy plaster on his arm. Mooney grabs him by the elbow and tugs him close by the arm, twisting them both around so he can stare at the bit of black visible through the thin gauze.
Do you need to keep it covered?
Amelia said until the evening.
He answers.
It's evening.
Remus says, glancing once at the clock on his bedside table.
And you still haven't told me what it is.
Sirius sighs, cheeks coloring, and he taps his fingers against the edge of the plaster to release the sticking charm holding it on with a muttered finite. Mooney peels it back, eyes wide, face still flushed red, and he lets out a little lovely sigh when the plaster finally pulls away.
Oh.
He says, voice thick.
Oh, that's lovely.
His fingers ghost across it, not quite touching, but still leaving Sirius with goosebumps on his arm.
Prongsy's matches.
He tells Mooney. He smiles.
Did Peter draw this?
He traces just over the lines forming Padfoot's paw print, down into the center where 3 runes sit, nestled inside the pad of his heel. Brother, family, future. The heat from Remus's wandering fingers warms up the already hot, healing skin over the ink, and makes Sirius shiver just a little.
Yeah.
Sirius reaches with his free arm and scoops Mooney against his chest, pressing his face into Remus's hair and breathing in the smell of his shampoo.
But I added the runes.
Remus tilts his face up, catches his lips against the line of Sirius's jaw, and leaves a kiss there.
It looks good.
Mooney murmurs against his jaw, and Sirius can't help the grin that splits his face when Remus's lips move lower. He forgets about the ache in his arm, trades that heat for the warmth of Remus's lips against his neck, and his fingers slipping down against Sirius's bare chest. By the time Sirius works up the requisite store of courage to ask for the rest of his recommendations, October is well underway. Flitwick, it turns out, knew he was coming. The words weren't out of his mouth after the end of Charms class before Flitwick was pressing a roll of parchment into his hands with a little, frankly cheeky, wink. Sirius thinks he might have been tipped off. McGonagall promised to let him do it on his own. He remembers that, but he's sure the professors talk. He knows McGonagall and Flitwick spend the evenings together, thanks to late nights with the Marauder's map open on the floor in front of him. Either way, that's 2 out of 7 that he didn't even need to ask for. He stacks it in his trunk next to McGonagall's without even reading it. He's sure Flitwick didn't mention that Sirius likes to spend Charms class with his boots on his desk, leaning back in his chair and thinking of all the things he'd rather be doing. Or that time he charmed Eliza Pickleberry's eyebrows green in 3rd year, which was really just a practical example of the theory that Flitwick was writing out on the board. Or the time he charmed Snape's textbook to insult him loudly in the middle of an exam. The teeth and tongue were a creative touch, but that was transfiguration work. Or the time he stuck Mulciber's desk chair to the ceiling with a permanent sticking charm, and then floated Mulciber up there to join it. That was just being gentlemanly. He's sure none of that is in there. But regardless, Flitwick's promptness puts him on a bit of a roll. He manages to ask Pomfrey on Saturday when he takes over for her in the hospital wing. She doesn't have the scroll ready, not like Flitwick, but she does give him a secret little smile and disappears into her office, leaving him with a 1st year with a broken wrist and a 3rd year who exploded an invisibility solution over her entire left side. She was reappearing nicely after having been slathered in antidote, at least. The same couldn't be said for the firstie, who needed a chocolate frog and pep talk to go with his bone-mending charm before he stopped wailing. He leaves the hospital wing with a third recommendation in his bag and a skip in his step, enough of a boost to have him weaving his way down to the library to pick up 3 new pleasure-reading books and put on his best big eyes to ask Pince to be his 4th. She does have a scroll for him, plus 2 new novels from the Muggle fiction section and a biography of Glover Hipworth, the chap who perfected the pepper-up potion. He gets a bit choked up reading her scroll.
A naturally curious and inventive student, often found in the stacks, engineering solutions from multiple sources.
Leaves him with a funny, thick feeling in his throat. The problem, it turns out, isn't Vector, who was more than happy to extol Sirius's limited virtues while backhandedly calling him a troublemaker. Sirius did catch the
despite Mr. Black's sometimes frenetic nature
at the start of the second paragraph, and
Mr. Black's advanced preparation often leaves him needing advanced work to keep him appropriately occupied during class time.
It was accurate, if unnecessary, and Sirius thinks weaseling a recommendation out of Vector is a downright miracle, given how Vector probably sleeps with a copy of the Hogwarts Rules of Conduct under his pillows, and Sirius has 126 detentions on his permanent record. Nor is the problem Professor Sprout, who cheerfully takes on the task while they're harvesting cuttings of mature mandrakes under 3 layers of silencing charms over Greenhouse 6 and gives it to him the very next night on the way out of dinner. The problem, it turns out, is Fowler. Professor Fowler was an Auror before joining the Hogwarts staff. He's the gruff sort that Sirius thinks all Aurors turn into by the end of their tenure. He still has all his bits, which is more than some Aurors can say, but Sirius is sure his head's been addled by all the curses. Most of the Hogwarts faculty know about Remus's furry little problem. It's integral to him getting the lenience he needs around the full moon. And that's all right. The vast majority of the staff has a compassionate bone somewhere in their body. Fowler doesn't. Sometimes Sirius thinks a werewolf wronged him personally, or something like that, with the way he acts. He gives no latitude to Remus, not even if class is the morning of the full moon, when the moon is still fat and heavy in the sky. Sirius has, personally, shoved himself into Fowler's office and shouted at him more than once about scheduling exams on full moon days. Moony is a good student, a hard worker. His marks are important to him, a sort of personal validation that he's meant to be at Hogwarts. Fowler seems to think Remus doesn't belong there, which is absurd on its face. Hogwarts without Moony is unimaginable. So Sirius has an uneasy truce with Professor Fowler. He ignores him, mostly, and outright defies him when he must. Sirius is distrustful of the Aurors on principle. Whether that's a latent effect of the Black family or a healthy distrust of authority, he doesn't know, nor does he particularly care. He's been decent enough to the man, though, lately, and his defense scores have always been tops. So he knocks on Fowler's office door without much trepidation and pushes in when the little statue of a songbird outside tweets at him, granting him entrance.
Black,
Fowler gruffs out.
what brings you to my office today?
He steps into the middle of the room. His hands are stuffed into the pockets of his robes, and he feels suddenly uneasy in the middle of Fowler's office, staring into the foglass he keeps behind his desk.
I'm applying to Oxmag for the fall,
He says, not bothering with pleasantries or waffling. He's gotten better at this spiel since Flitwick, when he could hardly get the words out. Not that he needed to, since Flitwick was a hero amongst men and saved him from his own stumbling and fumbling over words.
So I've heard.
Fowler leans forward in his chair, watching him with a closed expression on his face.
I'd like it if you'd write me a recommendation for the healing program.
Sirius says. Fowler watches him for a moment, fingers tapping against the side of his teacup.
No,
He says,
I don't think so.
Chapter 3, 3 Mornings. Arcturus. The Hogwarts Board of Governors meets in an ordinary little room on the 7th floor of the castle once a year. The plain oak door is unremarkable, stamped 7X in fading gold leaf in the center. Its importance is marked only by 2 portraits on either side, Godric and Helga to the left, Rowena and Salazar on the right. It's only then, once a year in November, that they meet in full on the grounds. For the most part, Arcturus's obligation is fulfilled through owl post and the occasional ad hoc meeting in London, usually followed by a round of cocktails and Erdogan Gimbold smoking his noxious-smelling pipeweed. He doesn't mind the hike to Scotland once a year. That the school is impenetrable by means other than flu is a distasteful necessity. Arcturus is too old to be caught tramping along the old path to Hogsmeade, and, while the flu was certainly quicker, there was a certain charm to riding up along the cobblestones in a thestral-drawn carriage. It sends his memory cartwheeling back in time to when he was a boy, coming up from Hogsmeade Station at the start of term. He does not miss his boyhood, but the fondness of simpler times brings him a sense of nostalgia he cannot shake until he's made the long walk up and up to the 7th floor where the Board of Governors meets. The unappealing part of it is in the long, dreadful meeting. Too often, it's the 12 of them alone in the room for the duration, with nothing but average pastries and below-average tea and juice. Walburga's monster of an elf could bake better croissants in half the time. Of that Arcturus is certain. Today, however, when he pushes open the door, Albus Dumbledore is waiting on the other side with a goblet of pumpkin juice and a benevolent grin on his face. The very sight of him so early in the morning, it's only 9:30, hardly pumpkin juice time, sets his teeth on edge. This is made worse by the fact that they're the only two in the room.
"Good morning, Mr. Black,"
Dumbledore says. He dips into what can almost be called a curtsy. Arcturus tries very hard not to roll his eyes.
"Albus, I trust the boys are behaving themselves."
"Far more than usual, which is suspicious in its own right."
Dumbledore waves to Arcturus's usual chair, at the head of things, where he properly belongs. It slides out across the stone of the floor.
"From what Horace tells me, Mr. Black is training for the Quidditch season, as though he's going to sit an owl in it this spring."
Arcturus slides into his seat.
"Regulus is competitive by nature. It's the unfortunate side effect of being a second son, or so I gather from my own dear brother."
He pauses a beat.
"And serious.
"Quite busy with Poppy in the hospital wing?"
I expect nothing less, given his goals."
Arcturus says.
"Regulus tells me he's collecting recommendations for Oxford."
Dumbledore nods.
"He also tells me that stick-in-the-mud, washed-up aura you employ refuses to give him one."
This, Arcturus thinks, is a slight that in generations past might have been worth a dual challenge. How dare that pissant Fowler offend the House of Black?
"Who Professor Fowler thinks positively of is, I fear, outside my scope as his superior."
Dumbledore shakes his head.
"There are a number of other professors who can step into that role for him."
"I expect one way or another his needs will be met."
Dumbledore arches an eyebrow, questioning but not quite aloud at him.
"I expect the second son of a family such as the Potters can manage on his own, without my intrusion."
There it is, Arcturus thinks, his blood boiling in his veins. He says nothing because he can't, not until his plan has come to fullness. It's one thing to have a luncheon with a wayward grandchild, another entirely to brazenly disregard the wishes of his formal heir, for now at least, until Regulus comes of age. He has a count in his head, 6 months until he can reclaim his own legacy.
"What brings you to the board today?"
He asks instead of what he wants to say. If Albus Dumbledore had been on the advance agenda, Arcturus didn't know. He did not read it, merely stamped his seal on the back of the envelopes his secretary brought him in September for their November meeting.
"Ah, yes, it's a curious thing. The heads of houses have been scheming, and I come with a proposal to add an elective class, starting in the fall."
"Have you finally given in to Minerva's long-suffered wish of eliminating divination?"
He taps his temple.
"I suppose that wouldn't come as a surprise to any competent professor of divination, were it to happen."
That pulls a chuckle out of Dumbledore.
"Alas, no. Minerva must suffer another year of tea leaves and crystal balls. This is an addition to the current offerings."
Arcturus raises an eyebrow.
"This was not on the agenda."
He guesses. Albus inclines his head in agreement.
"It was brought to my attention this morning. I do believe they plotted an ambush, so to speak."
He produces a packet from his robes and slides it across the table to Arcturus, who takes it in hand and peers at the top sheet of parchment. All 4 of the heads of houses have signed off on it, right there in glossy ink. Dumbledore's own signature is there too, in ink so fresh it's nearly wet.
"Muggle history."
Arcturus feels his lip curl even as he says it.
"As it relates to wizarding history, fascinating, isn't it?"
"Irrelevant,"
Arcturus says. He goes to push the packet away, but Dumbledore stops him.
"What use would a Hogwarts witch or wizard find with Muggle history?"
One might notice, if they cared to look, interesting parallels with our own history.
Dumbledore says.
I have no doubt I can manage a majority vote without you. I do think, Arcturus, you might want to read the entire proposal.
He glares but settles back with the packet. He doesn't bother with the proposed curriculum that will, if this is approved, change 1,000 times. The content of classes is broadly up to the instructor at Hogwarts. Always has been since Salazar himself walked the halls. There is, interestingly, a note there in emerald ink and McGonagall's neat hand that the professor might, if things go well, absorb the Newt-level history of magic classes. If this is her backdoor way of removing Cuthbert Binns from his position, it would be the most interesting thing about the woman, and he might have to reform his opinion of her. Arcturus knows, of course, of the things she's done for Sirius. He knows far more as the head of their family than he'd ever say. It's uncouth to talk about some things. He takes Minerva's terse monthly letters in the quiet privacy of his office at Chateau d'Emeraude. This doesn't, however, alter his opinion. Minerva McGonagall is and always will be a half-blood, Quidditch-obsessed Gryffindor. She might, he thinks, as he pages through the packet, have a Slytherin streak at least an inch wide. One day, she'll be the headmistress of these halls, and if her plans include sacking incompetents like Binns, he might find himself an unlikely ally.
They've certainly done the legwork,
he says. He pauses to peer up at Dumbledore.
You don't need me, as you've said.
There's something there in Dumbledore's eyes, an odd bit of twinkle that's more calculating than mirthful.
Minerva's quite thorough,
he says.
She's even sourced an instructor. I'm sure you're familiar. Remus Lupin.
Remus?
Are you enjoying the work, Mr. Lupin?
Remus tries, as if it's possible, to squish himself even smaller into the seat in front of Dumbledore's desk. He hates this. He doesn't like being in the spotlight, even on the best of days, and certainly never before breakfast. That's for James, or Sirius, or even Peter, though Peter much preferred to hide in the back alongside him, split chocolate frogs and a packet of crisps, while James and Sirius made fools of themselves. He can't escape out from underneath Dumbledore's piercing blue gaze, though, and McGonagall is in the corner, leaning up against a stone-white pillar with her arms crossed over her chest. If it weren't for the look on her face, he'd have thought he'd managed to get himself into trouble. There hasn't been much time for that, with all the marking he's been left to do, on top of helping Peter pass charms and reading over James's Muggle studies work, and the wedding planning, as slowly as that's been progressing.
It's going well.
He finally answers, far too late to not sound suspicious, which is ironic given that for once they haven't actually been up to anything, no good or otherwise.
Professor McGonagall says you've been a welcome addition in the staff lounge.
Dumbledore looks away from him, flicks his gaze to McGonagall, who stares back with something steely and inscrutable in her eyes.
The staff have been very welcoming,
he says almost reflexively. He wonders if there's been a complaint. He's mostly there when McGonagall is. She offered to sit with him while he did his marking, and he took her up on it right away. Pomfrey expanded Sirius's time in the hospital wing at the start of term. He's there 2 nights a week now, in addition to all day on Saturday, which means terrible things for Remus. No Sirius to be a warm and elbowy blanket across his back, but also no Sirius to distract James and Peter from distracting him from the piles and piles of marking. Spending his afternoons with endless cups of tea and Flitwick cracking jokes across from him isn't a half-bad way to spend an afternoon. He likes the work. Even Slughorn's been a treat, offering him candied pineapple bits and clapping him on the back. Remus could do without the countless my boys that have been thrown his way in the last few weeks, but he was raised better than to say so to the headmaster of his school. Hope Lupin would have his guts. There's Fowler, who hates him, of course. He's hated him since the moment he set eyes on him during roll call that first class in first year. A pity, too. Remus might have liked Defense Against the Dark Arts more if he didn't spend half of his classes wondering if he were about to be outed or hexed, or both. But they've been avoiding each other in the lounge, posting themselves on opposite ends of the room, not even glancing in each other's directions. A Cold War is a war Remus can tolerate. He's actually been meaning to have words with someone. Not to Dumbledore, he isn't that sort of fool, but McGonagall might listen, about the rotten things Fowler said to Sirius last week, when he asked for and did not receive an Oxmag recommendation. That sent poor Padfoot spiraling a bit, especially that night, and resulted in the most technically perfect but somehow spiteful 30 inches on the legal ramifications of Veritasirum that Remus could imagine. It's one thing, Remus thinks, to say no. It's another entirely to call a man a dark scion with a fetish for danger. That's beside the point, and not at all what he's being asked. Remus shakes his head, takes a breath to clear his thoughts, and offers a pathetic little smile up at Dumbledore. He can't shake the nerves conjuring butterflies in his stomach, even though he knows he's done nothing wrong at all.
That's good.
Dumbledore says. He flashes his gaze back to McGonagall again.
Professor McGonagall tells me you've an aptitude for teaching. The students you've tutored nearly sing your praises.
Well, I haven't taught them harmony, so I hope they didn't try.
He barely catches himself and has to physically bite down on the side of his tongue to stop himself from saying anything more. That twinkle in Dumbledore's eye, the same one that had been there the day he broke into the Lupins' little cottage and colored pictures with 10-year-old Remus on the floor of their sitting room, turns on Remus.
Would you like to, Mr. Lupin, if given the chance?
Peter. There's a certain joy to being a rat. He likes how small he gets, the way he can scurry under his bed in the dormitory and bed down in his little box of hay. He likes how he can fit in small places, the way that makes it easier for him to slip into cracks in the wall and find his way into the Hufflepuff common room when the situation usually being whichever Hufflepuff he's seeing, calls for it. He has a love-hate relationship with how often his friends forget that he's sometimes a small, hidden rodent under his own bed. No one can miss Padfoot, slobbering beast that he is, and Prongs is so out of place inside a building he doesn't border on impractical so much as he's clear across the globe from it. Prongs without the cloak is nothing but brash energy and snark, pounding down the hallways without a hint of subterfuge. Animagerie couldn't save him from that. But Peter is small, and his friends aren't famous for their situational awareness either way. He hears things he shouldn't, things he often doesn't want to. More than once, he's heard the sound of Padfoot orgasming, loud bugger that he is. He burrows further into his hay on those occasions, wishing he had the raw power he needs to wordlessly and wandlessly cast a silencing charm. He heard James crying that time he broke his elbow, and stubbornly refused to go to the hospital wing. He's heard Mooney, more than once, having a whispered argument with himself about any of a variety of topics, usually his self-worth, which if Peter were a different sort of a man in a different sort of universe, those occasions might plant a seed that takes years to grow, but blooms with thorns and tears the world asunder. It's useful to know what storm is coming. The week before Sirius's birthday, he's sleeping pleasantly in his little box when he's rudely awoken by the door slamming open. He hears the sound of Padfoot's leather bag hitting the floor, the muffled thump of books against stone, and he can't help but listen when his ears perk up.
That cunt Fowler!
Padfoot starts, loud enough to wake the dead in Hogsmeade Cemetery. Peter listens, curled up in a ball under the slats of his bed, and he plans. It's 2 days later that he's sure and ready, so he waits until breakfast is nearly over and Padfoot and Mooney have fucked off to who knows where to elbow James in the ribs.
I've got mischief,
he says. James looks up from his egg-soaked toast with a glimmer in his eyes and a slow, contented grin spreads across his lips.
Tell me more, Mr. Wormtail.
He says as he unpins his head boy badge from his robes and slips it in his pocket. It's a birthday gift, they decide. It's only appropriate. Padfoot's birthday falls on a Friday, which is undoubtedly the best day for mischief. James has plausible deniability in the morning, since he spends it on the grounds doing an observation of a Glumbumble hive with Kettleburn as part of a capstone project he's been working on for the better part of a year about magical insects. Peter himself makes a great show of taking off down the Hogsmeade Lane with Marlene and Lily, who lose themselves in some argument about Newt's-level potions, and he shakes them by the time they make it to the Hog's Head. From there, it's nothing but a quick double back to the castle through the Honeyduke's cellar after he's seen with a pint in the Three Broomsticks. He's got the cloak folded in his pockets, but he hardly needs it, not for this bit at least. The passage is small and pitch black, lit only by wand light, and it gives him time to think. James was integral to the plan, not just for his transfiguration work, which is always top tier, but for the dozens of connections he's been sewing in the various departments of the ministry. But the execution, that is for Peter, his plan, his glory. Giles and Mildred Pettigrew raised a good son. They took the time in their travels to teach him lessons above and beyond what he'd learned at Hogwarts, both before and after his 11th birthday. He's seen the world. He's met dozens of professors of magical history, of ethics, even the dark arts once or twice. He knows a thing or two about academia, mostly that he wants no part in it. But he also knows the oft-quoted saying is wrong. Those who can't teach isn't right. Not for most. There's a noble calling, a sort of soul-deep dedication to spreading knowledge that's required because teachers often are not well paid. Hogwarts professors are no exception. Unlike, for example, Aurors, who make enough gold to pad a large vault at Gringotts and live a lavish enough life to satisfy even a posh tosser like Padfoot. Peter knows the academic sort. Fowler isn't one of them, but he's here, in Hogwarts, and has been for nearly a decade instead of in the Auror department, nosing his way to department head like his father and his father before him, all the way back to the Dark Ages. He squirrels his way out of the passage at the Hunchback Witch and pulls the cloak over his head in a dark little alcove. From there, it's a jaunt to just outside the defense classroom, where the doors are firmly closed and there's very little noise inside. There's fifths on Friday mornings, he knows, Slytherins and Ravenclaws, and he's got very little time to do what he needs to do. They set the trap last night, him and Prongs bleary-eyed and exhausted, waiting for Filch to give up his rounds and tuck in for the night. He's just got to set it and scurry off into the dark behind the suit of armor to the left. It's a pity the rest of them aren't going to get to see it. His magnum opus, the one he's sure, above all else, will go down in history. The Aurors keep tidy records. There's photographs and long, detailed documents from every investigation. Peter's sure there's a list somewhere, probably in that paranoiac Alastair Moody's desk, of who drank the last cup of coffee without resetting the coffee-making charms. Even, for the right price or with the right connection, things the Auror department would rather tuck neatly under the rug. From under the cloak, Peter lets a grin split his face. The arc of justice is long, he thinks. Fowler deserves this for more reasons than cutting remarks at Padfoot. Mooney's been under his boot heel for 7 years, grinding his teeth and biting his tongue at every half-cloaked barb about killing werewolves Fowler threw out. But the chickens always come home to roost.
Finita incantatum,
he says, pointing his wand up toward the candelabra above the door and ducking behind the suit of armor in one stumbling motion. The hallway explodes in color and sound, like a brass band is directly outside the door. Posters unfurl from the walls and streamers fall from the candelabra. Confetti floats down onto the ground, exploding into little mounds of colored sand as they hit the floor. The door slams open, and there Fowler stands, gape-mouthed and flanked by gossipy fifths, and confronted with a dozen colorful reminders of the time he stole illegal potions and powders from the evidence room at the department, the photographic evidence of him, high on doxy dust or gilly weed with his trousers at his knees, stumbling arse out across the cobblestones in Nocturne Alley with Alastair Moody at his heels, wand out.
mischief managed.
Peter thinks as one of the Slytherin fifths steps forward into the rainbow dust and asks,
Professor, is that you?
Chapter 4, Minerva.
I know it was your lot.
McGonagall says on a cool November morning, just a scant few days after Peter's magnum opus led Fowler to take an unexpected leave of absence. Newt-level defense fell to the junior professor, a tiny little man in tweed who looks like a strong wind will bowl him over, but can throw a cutting hex with startling accuracy. Sirius rather thinks, in his own private inside thoughts, that the man ought to have been the Newt professor, anyway. He was wasted on 1st through 4th Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs, and seems to be enjoying his foray into upper-class men. Pete was just doing everyone a favor, really.
I was in the hospital wing, and Mooney was with you,
he says, leaning forward to peer over the stack of books on her desk to where an old tartan robe lay across her desk blotter. She's smoothing the fabric down with both hands, quick and efficient strokes across wool, steam rising from a wandless ironing charm under her palms. She looks up from staring hard down at the fabric at him, eyes narrowing.
Potter and Pettigrew.
James was off with Sprout, and Peter was at the broomsticks.
He takes a loud slurp of tea and meets her gaze with a steady one of his own. He didn't spend a decade and a half with Walburga Black and not learn how to bluff. Part of him wants the credit because Fowler is a cunt and a bastard, but he knows better than to take it. Pete'll spend a dozen Thursdays polishing the silver in the castle, and he can, Sirius knows, hold a grudge like no other. So he keeps mum because he also wants to keep his head attached to his shoulders. He'll live vicariously through Mooney's rendition of the staff lounge that afternoon, and take solace in the fact that he's not going to have to see Fowler for at least the foreseeable future. He doesn't need that washed-up twat of an Auror. Sinestra, it turns out, doesn't consider him a dark scion, and was more than willing to hand over a recommendation, even though he stopped taking astronomy as soon as he was allowed.
I haven't figured out how.
McGonagall says, clipped and even as ever.
But I'm sure it was you and yours. The timing, Black, is suspect.
He bites back a snort.
I haven't got a clue what you mean.
The crown on your head, Black.
She waves a hand at him.
I'm sure Potter considered it a nice birthday gift.
Sirius raises both eyebrows.
We've grown up, and if we had done it, which we didn't, he deserved it.
She closes her eyes, expression pinched, hands still holding down the edges of her robe. There's a moment where Sirius thinks he's going to get a thrashing, but she mutters a cutting hex instead, and there between her hands is a perfect length of cloth.
I don't approve,
she tells him as she thrusts the scrap of robe at him.
I expect you and Potter will one day learn discretion. There's better ways to exact revenge than public shame.
He takes it without a word and settles back into the chair.
Now,
she says suddenly all business.
Tell me, has Mr. Lupin made up his mind, or is he still worrying himself into a tizzy?
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic, composed by Burning Aurora, Caliana, and Flowerhawk.